thinking about. I am Mim and I'm joined by Salina, Nilyana, and Romesa. We are all students at St. Saviour and St. Olave's, and this evening we are talking to Professor Richard Blackburn, who's going to tell us about sustainable fashion. The carbon footprint of the fashion industry accounts for over 10% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. There's no question that fashion is having a serious negative effect on the environment. Experts agree that we need to change from fast fashion to sustainable fashion, but what does that mean? Professor Richard Blackburn, Professor of Sustainable Materials at the University of Leeds, will help us understand terms like greenwashing, cruelty-free clothing, ethical fashion, slow fashion, conscious fashion, and circular fashion. Professor Blackburn is here to tell us more. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Am I okay to share my screen and start the presentation then? Good. Right, hopefully this works. Let me start. So, can I confirm that you can see my presentation? Nice one. That's great. Well, first of all, thank you very much to everyone for asking me to give this presentation this evening. It's a great chance to get to speak to a different type of student that I'm speaking to every week. I mainly teach undergraduates and master's level students at the University of Leeds, but it's fantastic to be able to speak to other students as well, because you're all consumers and you're all going to be consumers throughout your life. And if there's one item, consumer product item, that every single one of us has and interacts with, it's clothing. We are in contact with clothing most of our lives. There's a very few limited numbers of times when we're not in contact with clothing, and we're buying these things all the time. And it's really important that we think about what the impact of clothing is. So I'm up at the University of Leeds. I run a large research group, and we work on various different research projects in trying to make more sustainable textiles, textile processes, new fibers, new dyeing and finishing processes. So I'm going to talk to you today about some of the issues within the fashion industry, and then we can have a chat about it at the end. So first and foremost, let's think about all products. Why do we need sustainable products at all? Well, fundamentally, it's based on population. And we just, I don't know if you saw in the news very recently, we just reached 8 billion people on the planet very recently. And it's predicted that by 2050, although actually I think it might occur before then, we're expected to get to over 9 billion people on the planet. And of course, all of this increases the demand for the very basic things that we need to live, like food and energy and water. And the manufacture and use of these consumer products all increases pollution and waste and depletion of non-renewable resources, as I'm sure you're all aware. But actually, the issue is not just about fundamental population increase. It's actually about the number of consumers on the planet. Man-made products and the processes that we have to make them provide us with a better quality of life. The things that we buy, the stuff that we want, is all because we want a better life. We want to enjoy things and have better health and have nicer things around our home. And the issue with the earth is not just the population increase, it's actually the number of growing middle class people, the increasing number of consumers around the world who also want these products. And there's a huge rapid increase in countries like Brazil, Russia, India, China, what's referred to as the BRIC nations, in the number of consumers. And it's predicted that by 2030, there'll be nearly 5 billion consumers on the planet. And it's consumers who are wasteful. It's the consumers who buy too much stuff. And it's the consumers that are the focus area for really where we need to be more sustainable. But let's go back to synthetic fibers, an area of textiles that I'm sure you're aware of. We have natural fibres that come from plants, on animals that we can grow, but we also make a lot of fibres. And the thing that we can't avoid is that synthetic, often referred to as plastic fibres, are fantastic inventions. I think in this modern situation that we have now, where people are quite negative towards synthetic fibres in terms of their impact, they actually forget, why did they evolve in the first place? Why were they invented? And the reason is because of their amazing properties. Not just for these amazing examples of wonderful fashion that you can see on your screen right now, but because they're stronger, they last longer, they can do lots of different things, have different properties that we don't currently have in natural fibres. So we can't ignore the fact that they provide a technical function that we don't get from nature. So it's not always an issue that we can just say, well, let's just forget using them. Let's throw them away and stop using them. Because we've got used to using them. We've developed a requirement for these products because they're better sometimes than what we can get from nature. And that's a really difficult thing to manage in a sustainable society. So I've said sustainability several times, and I looked back over a few of your previous thinking about presentations, and I know that people who've attended some of them before have touched on sustainability before. But for those of you who are not familiar with the subject, let's think about what the fundamental definition of sustainability is. And these are the definitions: taking no more potentially renewable resources from the natural world than can be replenished naturally. And that's important, because it's not just an answer to say, well, let's just grow everything, because we've only limited agricultural space on the globe in which to grow things. So the answer is not always just, well, let's just grow everything and that'll be fine, because it's not as simple as that. We can overload the capacity of the environment to cleanse and renew itself. So again, if we are going to grow things, take things from nature, we need to do that as cleanly as possible too. And basically, resources are sustainable if they can't be used up. It's what we sometimes refer to as a circular economy, so that the product can go round and round and round. We can renew it, we can revitalize it, we can recycle it or upcycle it. And I'll talk a few examples as we go through. Fundamentally, sustainability is built on these three pillars. Most people, when they're thinking about sustainability, what they're actually thinking about is environmental impact. And that's very, very much within the news and the TV. We see about the environment all the time. The impact on the environment, what we're taking from the environment, the destruction of the environment, habitats of animals. And of course, that's incredibly important. It is a really, really important pillar of sustainability. But what's also a pillar is economics. Because again, sustainability and sustainable products only work if they work within an economic process. And what that means is we've got to be able to afford to buy them. If you make a more sustainable product and it costs 10 times as much, will people buy that? Some people might, because they've got a bit more money and they think, oh, well, I want to be nice and green and sustainable, so I'll spend more money. But not everybody will do that. And true sustainability comes from products that everybody can buy and everybody can invest in, not just a select few wealthy individuals. And the final pillar is society, people. We often forget in all of the focus on the environment and plants and animals and our ecosystems, which, as I said before, is incredibly important. We often forget about the people involved. What is the impact of the things that we are making, growing, using on people who live in those places? And we have to think about how much we pay those people who are making our products. That's really, really important too, because it's very nice for us in the UK to be able to accept, these lovely products that we can go out and buy very, very easily. Do we ever think about the people in the other parts of the world who are making these? The textile industry manufacturing is very much focused in Asia and Southeast Asia. Do we ever think about people in Myanmar, Vietnam, Bangladesh, Turkey, certain parts of South America, India, China? Do we think about people in those parts of the world and what are their lives in terms of manufacturing these products that we want and we use? And so when we think about sustainability, we often look at these different pillars, but these particular focus areas are also really important. If you look at what fashion brands and retailers are focusing on often, it's around raw materials. You'll see things like commitments to only using organic cotton or using recycled polyester and things like that. And the focus is all on raw materials. And that is important, but it's not the whole story. Because actually, sometimes the biggest impact in the life cycle, and that's from when the product is made right through its manufacturing to when you get it and use it through to the end of its life, through that life cycle, the biggest impact can actually be energy, the energy used in growing, making, using that product. And the same can be said for water. The textile industry is an incredibly thirsty industry. It uses a lot of water. And all of the use of these raw materials, energy, water, also creates emissions, and that's really important. And so the public understanding of a lot of these areas is actually something that sometimes I see and I get very, very frustrated with, because often we see terms like biodegradable, natural, organic. These terms are all nice and positive, and that you've got to have your products made out of these products that use these particular terms. Look at this example here. This is some baby clothing and baby wear, 100% organic for the ultimate green baby. The implication there being that your new baby, the most precious thing in your life, put it in organic cotton. But I could take a sample of regular cotton and a sample of organic cotton, take them into my laboratory, which is the next room behind me here, and I wouldn't be able to tell you the difference. It would be very unlikely that there would be any difference in those particular products. And yet the idea that one is potentially safer than the other is used to sell that product. And we often see other things like synthetic, non-organic, genetically modified as being bad, and the public avoiding products that use these processes. And I'm a chemist, and the idea of chemistry being something that's really, really scary. I know, obviously, you'll all be doing science and maybe chemistry at school, and some of you will absolutely love it. But I wish I had £1 for every time somebody said to me, oh, I hated chemistry at school. And I think that's a problem. I think it's a problem that people don't understand even the basic principles of science and chemistry, and that it's something that they can't understand. It's something scary, but actually everything around us is chemistry. And some of the best ways that we're going to deal with these problems is through using chemistry and other technologies to achieve those objectives. It's not just about growing things. It's about how we make things and using technology and processes to do that. And just for your information, I can give you lots of examples of things that are biodegradable, natural, and organic that are much worse for the environment than things that are synthetic, non-organic, and genetically modified. It's not about labels. We have to take every single product on its merits for what it is and how it's made. And that's really, really important. So it ends up with the question, does the public really understand what sustainable actually means? If we look at the ideal sustainable product, the first thing I would say is it needs to provide an equivalent function to the product it replaces. It needs to perform as well or better than the existing product. And that's fundamentally because only that way is it going to be desirable. If we think about the example of clothing, if somebody makes a more sustainable product, but it looks rubbish and it's bad design, who's going to buy it? It doesn't matter how green it is, but if you don't look nice in it, why would you buy it? Because first and foremost, you buy your clothing because you want to feel nice and look nice in it. And you want it to provide you with that first. And if it's sustainable and that's a great additional benefit, but it's not the most important thing. We also want it to be, as I said before, competitive in its price, maybe even at a lower price, and have a minimal environmental footprint for all of the processes involved in its lifetime. We might want it to be made from renewable resources and made from ingredients that are also safe for humans and safe for the environment, and particularly no negative impact around the areas where it's manufactured on people's basic life requirements like food and water. So I've said about life cycle analysis before, and that's what we use to try and understand when something is more sustainable than another product that you're comparing it to. And as I said before, that's about thinking about everything involved in the life of that product, from what it's made out of first and foremost, then how do we process it, manufacture it, how do we make it, how do we get it to the consumer, how do we sell it in the shop, what does the consumer do with it when they've got it, what's the life of that product, and then at the end, how is it disposed of? What are the disposable options? Can it be recycled? And so it's really important not just to think about where it starts, which is often the focus, but the whole lifetime of that particular product. So basically what happens at every point in between. Just switching very, very briefly from textiles, just to use this. And I won't play this video now. I'm going to make these slides available for the participants. Have a watch of this video. And what's really interesting, I'll tell you, what he's doing, this is a professor that I know who's in Canada, and he looked at the life cycle comparison of different types of cars. And he's asked the question, are electric vehicles, EVs, sorry, electric vehicles, really more sustainable? And the conclusion there is, if you think about the sustainability of driving a car, it depends. It's not so simple to say, well, an electric vehicle must be the best. Because, yes, they work on electric, but how is that electricity generated? Because if you live in China or India or Australia, all of your electricity is produced by burning coal. And actually, if you live in those countries, the most unsustainable or the least sustainable thing you can do is buy an electric vehicle. If you live in those countries, the most sustainable thing would be to buy a regular petrol or diesel car. If you live in a country where the energy is produced through exclusively green sources, such as somewhere like Iceland, then yes, definitely, an electric vehicle is definitely the best choice, because all of the electricity is produced through zero carbon sources. If you live in the UK, what's the best option? Well, in the UK, we have a mix of electricity production. We burn some fossil fuels, and we also have some coming from renewable resources like wind power. And so the answer actually in the UK is a hybrid. A plug-in hybrid is the most sustainable car you can use in the UK. And interestingly, the UK government has banned hybrids from 2030 because they think that consumers will think that electric vehicles are the best. And in the long term, when we switch all of our energy production over to green sources, an electric vehicle will be the best. But right now, if you have a plug-in hybrid at home, you've got the best car. Okay, so that's something you can tell your parents. It's not necessarily a purely electric vehicle. And we also have to think about what the car's made out of. There are lots of rare earth metals, and again, coming to your chemistry, have a look on the periodic table of elements. Try and find neodymium, praseodymium. They're rare earth metals, and you may have never heard of them before, but they're essential parts of catalytic converters, and particularly magnets that are involved in the recharging of electric vehicles. And the energy used to mine those minerals is huge. And so if you look at the carbon footprint of a typical electric vehicle, for certain examples, and this is not my work, this is another eminent professor at Princeton University in the US, they concluded that the full life cycle impact of an electric vehicle could be up to 10 times higher than a regular petrol or diesel car. Because at the moment, we've not made them efficient enough. We should move towards more sustainable vehicles, but the technology is not there just yet to say that they are better than what we've been using before. So that sometimes surprises people when I tell them that. So what are some of the main problems with textiles? In 2021, we consumed over 110 million tons of textile fibers for clothing. 75 million tons of that was synthetic fibers. Most of the fibers that we use in our clothing are synthetic, mainly polyester. Pull some clothing out of your wardrobe, look through the care labels, see what it's made of. You'd be surprised, because sometimes you'll think, oh, this is all natural fiber, and you'd be surprised how many times you see synthetic fibers in there. So just being aware of what you're actually buying is quite an interesting thing to do. The clothing industry creates carbon emissions of about 1.2 billion tons per annum. And what does that even mean? I mean, that's such a huge number. How can we even conceive of the impact? Well, one way is to compare it. And the impact of the textiles industry from a carbon emissions perspective is greater than aviation, greater than flying people all around the world all the time. 1 in 10 consumers throw away a garment rather than attempt to mend or alter it themselves. I don't know in your schools whether you do needlework anymore, or if you have you learned in school how to repair your clothing? Something that I think maybe is a skill that we don't see coming through anymore. Almost 3/4 of discarded clothing ends up in landfill, and less than 1% of clothing is recycled into other garments. We're working on these technologies at the university to try and improve them. And just to focus on an area that's very, very close to a lot of the work that I do, global dyeing processes use 5.8 trillion litres of water, which is equivalent to 3.7 billion Olympic swimming pools every year just in dyeing. And to look at energy, 391 terawatt hours of energy is used every year for dyeing processes. That's the same amount of energy consumed by the whole of the UK, everything we do in the UK, in 3 months. That's a lot of energy, and that's what's used every year, just in dyeing. That's not the rest of the production process for textiles, that's just the dyeing process. So we need innovations to try and improve this. And I said before, water and energy can often be the ways that we can improve sustainability with the highest impact. And that might not be as exciting or as interesting as saying, oh, it's made out of some interesting new fiber. But sometimes that can be the best way to make something more sustainable. But when did you last see a garment sold in a clothes shop that said, we've made this using less energy? It doesn't sound as exciting. And I think we need to change that, because we need to make people aware of the full impact of how we make clothing and all our consumer products. There's lots of challenges for synthetic fibers. They're non-degradable, they're non-renewable. We make them ultimately from oil, from petrochemicals. That's what we use fundamentally to make synthetic fibers. But the biggest share of all textile fibers in the world is polyester. More than 50 million tons per annum of that fiber that I showed you that we use is polyester. So we have to think about changing the raw materials for these fibers. And that's why people have moved towards recycling polyester, often recycling things like plastic bottles into making new fibers. That's not quite the answer, because really we shouldn't be using plastic bottles first and foremost. And we should be using what plastic bottles we do use to recycle into making new plastic bottles. What doesn't happen is recycling fiber to fiber. It's very difficult. And that's an area of research that we're focusing on at the university and trying to recycle fibre to fibre. I won't waste much time on this slide because I know we have limited time, but it's in there for your information. One of the most disappointing things in this country is that everything that we try to recycle doesn't necessarily get recycled. Only certain plastics do get recycled. So PET plastics and HDPE plastics. And you can see examples there of the types of products that use those do get recycled. But a lot of the other plastics do not get recycled because there isn't the infrastructure to do that at the moment. And despite all of our best efforts, sorting them out at home and putting them and collecting them and putting them out for the waste disposal people to collect, not all of that gets recycled. And that's because there's probably not a market for it. It's probably more expensive to recycle than to make it from synthetic materials. Don't think that there aren't problems with other fibres. Cotton is the most environmentally damaging fibre that we have. It consumes huge amounts of pesticides and insecticides. And to grow 1 kilogram of cotton, what's 1 kilogram of cotton? Maybe 2-3 pairs of jeans. I'm sure you all have maybe 2 or 3 pairs of jeans. To grow 1 kilogram of cotton requires about the amount of water you'll drink in your entire lifetime just to grow it. That doesn't include all of the dyeing processes and everything else, just growing cotton. And it also grows only in certain climates. You have to chop down rainforest potentially to grow it. And it uses a high area of land to grow that fibre. An organic cotton is not viable on a large scale either. And I'll mention that in the next slide. Here you can see the Aral Sea, which is between Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. It used to be the 4th largest lake in the world, and now it's a desert because the water was taken from it to irrigate cotton, to water the cotton fields. So we've transformed it within a very, very short space of time, the 4th largest lake in the world into a desert just to grow cotton. And that's in only one part of the world where we grow cotton. Organic cotton is a nice story in theory, but it just doesn't work for that fibre. It requires even more area of land to grow. And yes, it doesn't use genetically modified seeds and pesticides and things, which is good, but it still uses a heck of a lot of water. And that's the main problem with it. And that's why it's not sustainable. So what are the more sustainable fibre types? You're thinking this guy's really negative. All he says is really bad stuff. There are alternatives. There are amazing alternative sustainable fibres. Bast fibres, that's a term from the stem of the plant rather than the seed head, which is what you have with cotton. Some really amazing fibres that have really incredible properties. And some of the most sustainable fibres are regenerated cellulosics that we actually make from wood, like lyocell and modal, and environmentally friendly viscose. And wool, we've forgotten about wool. Wool is an amazingly sustainable fibre, and we just don't use enough of it. And I've mentioned also about recycled polyester. People ask me, what is the most sustainable fibre? And I always give the same answer. I've given the same answer for 20 years, which is the whole time I've been working at the university in this area. I always say lyocell. Lyocell is an incredibly sustainable fibre. It's made from growing eucalyptus trees in very well-managed forests, converting those trees into wood pulp in a similar way that you do for making paper. But then rather than making paper, you put it through a special production process using environmentally friendly solvents to make this fibre. Sometimes branded as Tencel or called lyocell. They're the same thing. It is an amazingly sustainable fibre. It does everything that we want cotton to do, but sometimes even better. But we don't use enough of it. We don't use enough of it. If you want an environmentally friendly solution, alternative to cotton, don't buy organic cotton, buy lyocell. And I have no shares in lyocell. I get no benefit or commission from the sale of those products. That's just my pure academic viewpoint. And just to compare, I won't waste a lot of time on this. Look at the difference in the amount of land that's used. This is from some published work, different types of fibers in different scenarios. But you can see easily there the amount of land required to grow 1 ton of lyocell, tencel, is about a quarter of the land used to grow a ton of cotton. You can see the difference in the amount of water used to produce 1 ton of cotton fiber versus 1 ton of lyocell. And here are some of the other impacts that we get when we do a life cycle analysis. And as I say, you can have these slides and you look at them in detail later. Again, there's another video here that you can play when you get the slides. What's happening now is not only are we making these fibers from wood pulp, from growing trees, but actually these people who are making lyocell are making a new fiber called refibra, where rather than using trees, they're using recycled cotton. So taking cotton and putting it through their special process to make a new fiber called refibra. You watch that video, that'll tell you all about it. So I already said that lyocell was the most sustainable fiber, but they've not stopped there. They're trying to make it even more sustainable than that by using waste materials as the feedstock rather than wood. Plastics in our ocean. I wish I had more time to talk about this. It's an area that people are talking about a lot now, and certainly the impact of laundry on our clothing. And this is another area where plastics get a really, really bad report in terms of their impact. But actually, when we look at plastics in the ocean, and particularly fibers in the ocean from laundry, the main fibers that are found are all cellulosic. 80% of fibers in the ocean come from cotton and other regenerated cellulosic fibers. And people think, well, it's okay to use those fibers because they're biodegradable. Well, it appears not. In the environment, in the ocean, these fibers are not biodegrading. And actually, when you think about it, that does kind of make sense, because the nice, fluffy cotton fibers that grow on the plant, by the time they've been through their lifetime for clothing, they're not the same thing. We take them off the fiber and we wash them and bleach them and do other chemical processes to them. Then we dye them, we put color on them. We might put other finishes on them to make them easy to iron or water repellent and other things like that. So by the time they go down the drain, either through laundry processes or other processes, they don't resemble anything we find in nature. So it's not surprising that these fibers are not biodegrading. And actually, we've done some work with the University of Exeter, and their work as environmental biologists is incredible. And they're actually starting to see that if they look inside animals that they found, such as sharks in this example, again, the fibers that they find in most of all are natural fibers. And they think that they could have a much worse impact, actually, as they slowly degrade inside the animal, rather than synthetic fibers that might not have the same impact. So it's not always so simple as to say, well, let's just use something natural, because that, as I said before, isn't always the best option. I'm nearly finished for those of you who've got questions. The biggest problem, however, is just how much stuff we buy. We buy too many items of clothing. We wear too many items of clothing. I can come up with whatever amazing sustainable innovation, and as can all sorts of other people. But actually, the biggest impact can be if we just buy fewer items and keep them for a long time. Don't buy cheap clothing that only lasts a few washes. Buy something that will last. Because I often say to people, don't buy an item of clothing that you're not prepared to commit to wearing at least 30 times. Because if you buy something for your holidays and say wear it once or twice and then throw it away, that is not sustainable. Think about those people in the world who are making that and it's just been thrown away and wasted. That is the least sustainable thing we can do. And I debated about whether to put this slide in because I think it's quite an upsetting story. But I think, you guys need to know these stories because they don't get reported on that well in the press. This was a disaster that happened in a textile factory. And I won't go into the huge details. You can read the full story if you like at the Rana Plaza disaster in Bangladesh. But this was making clothing for the UK and other parts of the world. And because of how poor conditions these people were in, because basically the factory owners don't get any money because all of the money is guzzled up by the brands and the retailers. And the people working with these products and making these products get such a tiny, tiny fraction that their buildings are unsafe, their factories are unsafe. And there was a disaster in a textile factory a few years ago, which killed a lot of people and injured a lot of people. And that's one of the costs of cheap fashion. If we had higher priced fashion and more money from the brands and the retailers went into the supply chain and paid people a fair wage and gave more money into that supply chain, fewer of these incidences would happen. And so that's one of the other reasons, coming back to that society issue, why we need to make this change. So lots of conclusions there for where we need to go in terms of more sustainable fashion, but I won't waste any more of your time, and I'll happily take any questions. And thank you so much for listening to me for the last half an hour. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. It was really interesting to hear the true impact of the fashion industry and the reality behind our clothes. We do have some questions, and I expect the audience to have some too. So audience, please type your questions in the Q&A box and we'll ask them for you. Salina, have you got a question to get us started?
Yes, I do have a question, but it's more of a general one. I would like to ask, how has the pandemic affected your future aspirations to be sustainable?
I think the pandemic makes me even more determined to be more sustainable. I think that some of the challenges that we faced in the pandemic is our reliance on using other parts of the world for manufacturing. And we ship items of clothing all around the world for different parts of the manufacturing supply chain of textiles. And that kind of came to a halt, not to a halt, but it was very severely disrupted during COVID. And I think that what that says really is we should actually manufacture closer to where products are used and actually stop moving things all around the world and try to get more local manufacture. And again, reducing the impact of transportation would also have a huge impact on the sustainability of clothing. So I think that the pandemic only served to say we need more to work even harder for more sustainable products.
Thank you. That was very insightful.
I also have a question to ask.
Okay.
Being sustainable, it does require, I think, high expenses to be able to achieve such sustainability. How do you suppose we can overcome this due to the financial crisis that we are currently going through?
That's a great question. Really good question. The problem we have is people use sustainability as a marketing tool to sell products at a higher price. Think about it. If you come up with a more sustainable item of clothing which uses less water, less energy, is more efficient in terms of not producing waste, that should actually be cheaper because you've used less resources and made and produce less waste in the process. And so more sustainable clothing can actually be cheaper. And the reason that it's more expensive is because of the marketing and the branding around that, because the brands and retailers think that you will be more likely to buy something if they put a sustainable label on it. So actually, the responsibility is on brands and retailers to bring down the cost of more sustainable clothing and to invest in more sustainable technologies, because they are affordable and actually can be even cheaper than current clothing. So it's difficult as a consumer because you think, well, how can I influence that? You know, it is very difficult. But what I would say is try to buy more sustainable clothing that's higher quality. And it might be more expensive for one item. But if you're committing to 30 wears, then over a full year, the amount of money you'll spend on your clothing could be the same or even less. You just buy fewer items. So as I say, one item might be more expensive on its own, but that's why you have to budget. You have to create a budget and say, I'm going to spend this amount of money on my clothing in this year or over these few months, and buy fewer items that are each more expensive.
Thank you.
I just had another question. You mentioned about terms like organic and how they have a positive effect on like consumers. So I noticed that like these like positive words and like labeling, they often have associations with greenwashing. And I wanted to know like how harmful greenwashing is in our industry, and how consumers can like see signs of greenwashing when they're purchasing something in a shop.
Yeah, that's another great question. You're right. Greenwashing is everywhere, and it comes back to that idea that people just use a label, and you will also, or not you, but the consumers think that means it's good. And I think that what you have to do is ask questions. You've got to be an active consumer, and you've got to go and you say to the person, okay, well, you've told me this product is more sustainable. Well, why? Why is it more sustainable? Don't just put a label on it. Don't just say it's natural or organic or whatever. Tell me why that means it's sustainable. And if they say, well, it's more sustainable because it's organic, they're not answering your question. You've got to say, well, why is that organic item or that natural item or that recycled item more sustainable? And make them answer your question. Because if they can't explain it, then the answer is probably they don't know the answer themselves, and they are greenwashing. They have to be responsible and tell you the reason why it's more sustainable. And there are laws coming in to try and prevent greenwashing, but as many consumer laws are, they're often ineffective, they're difficult to police, and so actually the real power is not with laws, but the power is with the consumer, and it's the consumer who will help to change that.
So I also have a question, and that is, so how are we able to make sustainable clothing more affordable given the cost of manufacture?
Yeah, I think that comes down to back to some of the things that I mentioned before. And sometimes some of the problems with cost of manufacture is that for more sustainable products, you're making fewer items, and it's a simple reality of economics, really. If you do a small number of garments, if you make, let's say, 1,000 garments, it's often more expensive to make that 1,000 garments than if you made 100,000 garments. And so it's what's called economies of scale. And what needs to happen is that brands and retailers need to invest in more sustainable products so that they can make more of them. Because as you make more, the cost of making one comes down, and they become more affordable. But be under no illusions. The actual cost of manufacturing a garment is tiny. You know, it is tiny. It's probably less than £1 per garment. And when I see garments that are sold for 30, 50, £100, and you know, they can't bring in sustainability there, then it's just greed. It's complete greed on the part of the brands and the retailers, because they want all of the profit for themselves and they don't want to give any to the supply chain. And again, we have to try to work with brands and try to purchase clothing from people who do respect people involved in manufacture of those, because there's lots of amazing people in the world who are manufacturing clothing, and they're very innovative themselves. We just need to give them a chance to get their products onto the market. And the answer isn't to say, well, let's stop everything and stop buying everything, because if we stopped buying clothing tomorrow, it would cause an economic disaster in those parts of the world that do make our clothing. But we can work with those areas because they're very resourceful and very innovative themselves in how they make our clothing. And so if we say, well, we want to work with you and make it in a different way and a more sustainable way, they will still have jobs, they will still be able to be employed and probably actually get paid better wages through those innovative processes.
We're just going to ask you a few questions that came up in the Q&A.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Yeah, so one of the questions from the students was, when worn out, can clothing be recycled, or is it a mix of fibers? Is the mix of fibers too complicated?
Well, a gold star to that question. That's a brilliant question. One of the main problems with recycling is mixing fibers. It's really hard to recycle certain fiber blends. And again, look at your care label. If it says, 30% this, 40% that, 20% this, 10% that of different fibers, that's a really horrible blend to recycle. So what should happen there is designers and people who are designing clothing should be trying to design products that are as close as possible as 100% one particular material, because that really helps us in our recycling. If a garment's made out of one particular type of fiber, it's much easier to recycle. So yeah, you're right. Fiber blends are horrible. They shouldn't be used. We should be trying to avoid them. And the reason that we have fiber blends is often because they're cheaper. We can put in certain percentages of cheaper synthetic fibers, and that allows us to use fewer of more expensive fibers. Some fibers can work. If you had a blend, let's say, of lyocell and cotton, that would be easily recyclable because they're very, very similar in their chemistry, those two fibers. They're both made from cellulose. So that would be okay. But if you've got something where the fibers are chemically very, very different, it would be very hard to recycle them.
Thank you. Another attendant has said that they've never heard of lyocell before, and they're asking if these clothes are readily available.
Absolutely. You can buy lyocell fibers. As I say, if you look in the care label, it's sometimes called lyocell, sometimes called tencel. You can also, there's a type of viscose. I'm sure people have heard of viscose, but viscose is a tricky one because not all viscose is green. There's bad viscose and there's good viscose. But there are good viscose like EcoVera. So they're often labeled things like EcoVera, and you can see them in the care labels. It will tell you which garments have lyocell and things like that in. But that's a really interesting point that you said you've never heard of it. And for me, that's really disappointing that more people aren't hearing about these fibers. That's not your fault. It's the fact that we're not hearing brands championing those fibers. And so rather than all of our focus being on telling people about organic cotton, they should be saying, let's champion lyocell and tell people how amazing that fiber is. So it's a good point. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we have another question, which is, how do you think shopping secondhand fits into sustainable fashion?
Yeah, another great question. Absolutely shopping secondhand, because if you've got quality garments and you want to buy something secondhand, you're extending those wears, those number of the commitment to wearing it. If you can extend that even further by giving it another 30 wears, then that's extending its life before it needs to be disposed of or recycled. So it's an incredibly sustainable thing to do. And part of the problem we have with clothing in recycling is that often people discard clothing and give it to charity, thinking they're doing the right thing. And that's really well-intentioned. And it's a tricky one, because I don't want to say to people, don't give clothing to charities, but what I would actually say is give high quality clothing to charity. If you get your item of clothing and think, would somebody really want to wear this again? Would somebody really go buy this in a charity shop? And your answer is probably not. Well, why would the charity shop put it on sale? They actually only sell a very small percentage of what they actually receive. And it's a difficult one, because I think that As I say, we don't want to discourage people from giving things to charity because they obviously get benefits for their charities through selling those clothing. And of course, those clothes can have an extended life. But I would restrict that to only give quality clothing. And actually, we could solve that through buying quality clothing in the first place. And if we committed to buying high quality clothing that lasts a long time, then when you're bored of it, then you can give it to a charity shop, but in the knowledge that somebody else probably will want it. But if you've bought your £2 t-shirt from a supermarket, who on earth is going to go to a charity shop and pay for a t-shirt that they can go to a supermarket and buy for £2? Why would they not just go and buy a cheap item from the supermarket, you know? So think about that when you're recycling clothing.
Thank you. And we have another very interesting question. So our attendee said, buying less is always something that economists and government in countries don't like to hear, as it kind of means a less production, output, and GDP. How could we break this equation and make sustainable a more convincing and popular cause for the humankind and Earth?
Yeah, and it's again quite a good question, and I think that it comes back to that point of let's make fewer items that are more expensive, that are better quality, and because we didn't used to have this situation. The society has existed with clothes for a long time, with fewer items being sold. You know, if you go back 50 years, people were not buying anywhere near the number of items of clothing that they were then, but we still had a very healthy textile industry, probably in many ways healthier than it was today. And so the answer is make better quality that you can sell for a higher price. Then you're satisfied because over your 1 year, you're going to make a similar amount of money. And the consumer's happy because they can still have new clothing, but they just can't have as many new items in that given year. We all have to make compromises here. And the compromise is that we have to buy fewer items, but maybe we can buy better quality that we can do more things with. And that company, let's say in 1 year, they sell 1,000 items at a very high price. They could probably maybe make even more money than the previous year when they sold 10,000 items at a lower price. And in the process, they used 10% of the materials, and you know the impact on the production of those materials is much lower, because if we only have to produce 10% of the materials to make those garments, then much lower impact overall. And the people in the supply chain, the manufacturing chain, can have more time dedicated to making better quality. They can get paid better, and they're not rushing through garments and making them incredibly poorly, incredibly quickly, and ending up in disasters like Rana Plaza. That was one of the problems in a factory that's putting through huge numbers of problems of garments. And the reason why that factory wasn't evacuated when there was suspicion that it might collapse was because that company could not afford to stop the machines running. Because if they stopped the machines running, they knew that that brand would go somewhere else for their clothing. And that's the situation that they had, that company, of course, you know, they don't get away, you know, without blame, but think about the pressure on that mill owner who couldn't close his factory because he would go out of business if he stopped the machines running. And that's the situation we've got ourselves into with fast fashion. And that's what we have to change.
Thank you. Another question that just came in was that more washability of the clothing may risk the volume orders for the manufacturing countries. Should we not consider that as a great threat for the economy of those countries? And if yes, what are solutions or like ways that will help?
Thank you. I think that comes back to that previous point, really, that I think that it's not an acceptable answer to say, well, if we reverse that situation and those countries stop producing millions and millions of items, that those countries will collapse. I don't think that's true. I think that we have to do smarter manufacturing in those countries that are reliant upon it and essentially pay them better per item that they're producing and allow them to produce fewer items. And if we pay them higher costs, we would pay higher cost of goods for individual items. They make fewer items, but on each item they make more money. That then balances that economy. It's not an answer just to keep saying we have to keep going as we are because somebody else will lose out somewhere else. We have to change something.
So we only have time for one more question, and the final question is, often clothing brands say that they are carbon neutral or environmentally friendly, but aren't generally sustainable. How can you tell where to buy them from?
Yeah, I think it just comes back to that previous point of asking them questions. Look on their website, see what they say about sustainability. Do they provide you with a satisfactory answer? If they provide some kind of wishy-washy statement of sustainability that you don't really understand, that probably tells you that they don't really understand sustainability. So scrutinize them. Look on their websites, find out their information, ask the questions, and basically be a nuisance. Because if you're a nuisance, they will have to answer the questions. And the people who are being sustainable should be confident in answering those questions and providing you with that information. And the people who don't understand it will flounder and not be able to answer the questions. And you're all smart, and you will all be able to see through the people who are telling the truth and the people who are telling lies. So I think you should put the pressure on them.
Thank you so much. So that was our last question for today. Thank you for taking the time to speak to us this evening and for answering all our questions. So everyone that attended, thank you for coming and for asking such insightful questions. We hope that you will join us for another Thinking About next term. So goodbye. Have a nice day.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for attending.